So the protests are quite massive in France, in fact, and it doesn't look like that it will stop very soon because of as you mentioned, the fact that President Macron wants to bypass the vote by the parliament. It's always difficult to say, because there's always discrepancy between the figures of the police and the official figures and the figures of the unions. But it's probably the massive strikes since '68 and the social movement of '68 in France.
Are you surprised by Emmanuel Macron's move? I mean, he knew that this was going to have some sort of huge reaction like we have seen on the streets, given that there have been months of protests against these reforms.
I think there are three reasons why there are a massive protest in France. The first is that it does not only concern the pension reform. In fact, it concerns the whole welfare system and what was implemented in France after the Second World War, the social justice of the whole social system. The second thing is that obviously the timing is quite bad because it happens in a time where there's inflation, economic difficulties. And the third reason, which is more linked to Emmanuel Macron itself, we don't have to forget that it's his second mandate and the last one. And for this term, Emmanuel Macron doesn't have the majority at the parliament, so he's a much more weaker president than he was after his first election.
So how damaging could this reaction be, and the fact that he has pushed these reforms through without it going through a vote in parliament? He could possibly face a vote of no confidence.
It's possible that he faces this vote of non-confidence, even if the leader of the right-wing party, Les Républicains, Éric Ciotti, already mentioned that he probably won't vote this non-confidence, but it can still happen. But more difficult is that how the government will be able to pass other laws with the parliament and the majority after this pension reform bill. Because one of the issues is that Emmanuel Macron doesn't have the majority at the parliament, so for each single law project, each single bill, he needs to have compromises with other parties, sometimes the left, sometimes the right. So it will be very difficult for him if he's using the 49.3.
What are the details of these particular pension reforms and why are they so contentious in France?
So it's, as you mentioned, it's increasing the retirement age from 62 to 64, but it's also increasing the number of years of work for every individual in France until 43. But above all, in fact, the issue is that it's a trend in France, because we don't have to forget that Nicolas Sarkozy already 13 years ago increased from 60 to 62, and now we are from 62 to 64. So one of the concerns of citizens and people in France is that when will it stop? What's the next step after 64? Will it be 65, 66? And I think that's one of the concern and issue of French strikers and protesters.
Well, as you mentioned, Macron made that change, and it seems like every French leader has made some sort of change to retirement laws. Do you think these particular ones are significantly different?
I think it was less expected than it was expected, for example, from previous governments such as Nicolas Sarkozy. But above all, the use of the 49.3, this specific clause in the French constitution, is also something that all French presidents have used in the past. Even the socialist one, we can think that they are more, a link to the democratic system. But Emmanuel Valls, under François Hollande, so the socialist president, used the 49.3 clause in the Constitution 6 times between 2015 and 2016. So I think it also was a bit of trauma for the French citizen, and it reminds them also that it's not something that they like when the president doesn't go through the proper democratic system.
Well, citizens aren't reacting very well. They're really unhappy about it. It looks like strikes will continue. There have been planned for some next week, as I understand it. Which are the sectors that are involved here, and what has the impact been on them, and what are they likely to do next?
So there are some very visual sectors, I can say. For example, in Paris, that's a bit the mess at the moment with the bins all over the place. And even the Ministry of the Interior asked the mayor of Paris to call the army to help, and she refused to do it.
Right.
But in fact, it's important to remind that it's not just one union that is calling for the strikes. It's a gathering of the eight largest unions, from the left to the right ones, who are together and call for the strike movement to continue. So it's very across all sectors, all unions and all political colours in terms of unionised.
Yeah, we did report on those massive piles of rubbish in Paris that are becoming quite hazardous at the moment. What is the state at the moment? Is it just going to continue on like that, a stalemate?
At the moment, there is no change. Once again, the last development was the mayor of Paris who refused, in fact, the call from the Ministry of the Interior. What happened at the moment is you have some private companies that have to play the role of the public companies that are used to deal with the bins and everything, but it doesn't seem that it will stop very soon. But also just in terms of image, it's also very risky because we don't have to forget that the next Olympic Games will happen in Paris in 2024. And I'm not sure it's a very good image in terms of attracting tourism if you have like bins all over the place in the streets of Paris.
Indeed. I think a lot of people would like workers to go back to work, the garbage collectors in particular in Paris. For them, it's an issue. So tell us, in summary, what's going to happen next? I mean, strikes will continue. Clearly, the future of Macron remains uncertain.
So what will happen is there will be a next massive day of strike, as they call it in France, which will happen next Thursday. So that's for the streets and the unions and the people who are demonstrating. In terms of the political game, the next step is really for Macron to use this specific clause in the French constitution and for the other parties at the Assembly to try to have and to organize this vote of non-confidence. So I guess what will happen in following days is that every party will be received by Emmanuel Macron at the Élysée. There will be even more talks and internal discussions. And probably one of the ideas of Emmanuel Macron is try to reach an agreement or with the left or with the Socialist Party or with the right, les Républicains, and try to be sure that there won't be any no confidence motion voting against him. The only risk for Emmanuel Macron is not, I absolutely do not believe that he will resign or leave the power, but the Prime Minister, because that's also the way that French political system works. If it continues, Macron will have to let her Prime Minister, Elisabeth Borne, leave and call for another Prime Minister. And what could happen, we saw that in the past with Jacques Chirac and Lionel Jospin. We could have a president from one political party, for example, Renaissance, but a Prime Minister from another party, les Républicains or Socialists. So that could, what we call a cohabitation.
Right.
So a Prime Minister and a President that do not belong to the same political party. It will be a massive mess because it's impossible to govern and it's impossible to vote law if you don't have the same political color.
That's for another day. You'll have to come in and talk to us about that. We could talk about that for a long time. Thank you very much for coming in, Natanael Bloch. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Evan.
Thank you.